I often wonder when exactly life began to shrink around me like an old coat losing its shape. There was a time when every day had meaning, when I woke up not to silence, but to the sound of another human being moving through the rooms, filling them with life. My wife, Evelyn, was never one for grand declarations of affection, but the way she brewed coffee in the morning told me more about love than words ever could. She knew I liked it strong but not bitter. 3 spoonfuls of ground beans, a pinch of salt to soften the sharpness, a ritual passed down from her mother. For 40 years I started my mornings with that smell drifting from the kitchen. Now when I make it myself, it tastes flat like a faded photograph. Evelyn has been gone for 7 years, and the house feels less like a home and more like a museum, where I am the only guard walking the halls and trying to keep the dust off memories. I am 72 years old, a retired history teacher. Once the classroom was my stage, and my voice carried over rows of restless students. I used to believe I was planting seeds of curiosity in young minds, that somewhere out there a boy or girl would remember a lecture about the Civil War or the Constitution and carry that knowledge into adulthood. Now I wonder if it mattered at all. When I retired, my colleagues gave me a watch engraved with my initials, and I smiled politely, though inside I was terrified of the silence that would follow. Teaching had given me rhythm, a purpose, and once it was gone, my days became a long corridor of sameness. I live in the same modest house Evelyn and I bought when our daughter Clara was born. The rooms have not changed much since then, though the wallpaper has faded and the carpet shows its age. Clara is 44 now, a successful businesswoman with a husband who talks like an attorney even at family dinners, always circling around the subject, always evaluating where the advantage lies. They live only 30 minutes away, yet the distance between us feels like another continent. When Evelyn was alive, Clara used to visit more often, sometimes bringing the grandchildren, who were still small and eager, to play with the old wooden toys I kept from her childhood. After Evelyn's death, those visits became less frequent, as if grief had not just taken my wife, but the fragile threads of family connection as well. Clara says she is busy, that her work demands her attention, that the children have their sports and their lessons. I nod, because what else can a father do but nod when his grown daughter explains why she has no time for him? The truth is, I do not ask for much. A Sunday afternoon, a phone call that lasts longer than a few rushed minutes, perhaps a smile that does not look rehearsed. But these small mercies have become rare, and in their place is a different kind of relationship, one that feels more transactional than affectionate. She calls me when something needs fixing, when money is required, when her husband is calculating a new investment and thinks my savings could be made useful. I tell myself that helping family is a father's duty, but each time I sign a check or transfer funds, I feel a little more like a hollowed-out tree still standing, only because its roots cling stubbornly to the ground. It is not that Clara is cruel outright. She simply treats me like a piece of old furniture. She dusts me off when guests arrive, wheels me out when it is convenient, but otherwise I am pushed to the corner, silent and out of sight. She laughs sometimes when she talks about my habits, about how I cannot adapt to modern life. She says I am stuck in the past, clinging to outdated things. Perhaps she is right, but I have my reasons. I keep my routines because they anchor me. I still read the newspaper with breakfast. I still write grocery lists on paper instead of using an app. And most of all, I still use my old flip phone, a device that seems almost prehistoric compared to the glowing slabs of glass everyone else carries. That phone is more than plastic and buttons to me. It is the last gift Evelyn ever gave me. She bought it the year before she passed, telling me it was simple enough that even you won't get frustrated with it. She was right, of course. I never cared for touchscreens or endless updates. On this little device, I stored voicemails from her, recordings of her laughter, her reminders about doctor's appointments, even the way she used to say my name when she wanted me to hurry up. I cannot bring myself to delete them, though I rarely listen because the sound of her voice still cuts me like glass. Over time, the phone became my archive. I recorded messages from my grandchildren when they were little. One of them singing a nursery rhyme off-key, another proudly spelling her name for the first time. These fragments of sound are the closest thing I have to living companions now. Clara does not understand. To her, the phone is a relic, an embarrassment, proof that I am unwilling or unable to move on. She insists that I should switch to a smartphone, that it would make it easier for her to text me, to share photos. I tell her I am fine as I am, that the phone works, and more importantly, it holds pieces of my life I cannot entrust to some cloud service I do not understand. She rolls her eyes, dismisses me with a smile that carries more pity than warmth, and tells me I am being stubborn. Perhaps I am, but what she cannot see is that this old device has preserved things more valuable than anything her sleek, fragile gadgets could ever hold. I have learned to live with the quiet, though it gnaws at me. My neighbors are polite but distant, younger families who wave as they rush to work or shuttle their children to activities. I walk slowly to the park when my knees allow, feed the ducks, and pretend that the laughter of children nearby belongs to my own grandchildren. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, phone in my pocket, waiting for it to buzz. Most of the time, it stays silent. When it does ring, more often than not, it is Clara, her voice clipped, efficient, already halfway gone before the conversation begins. She rarely asks how I am. She asks about documents, about the state of the house, about my accounts. If she does say she misses me, the words sound like lines recited for an audience. Still, I cling to hope. A father's heart does not surrender easily. I tell myself that maybe one day she will remember that I am not just a ledger of assets or a potential burden, but the man who carried her on his shoulders at the county fair, who sat up late with her when she cried over her first heartbreak, who worked double shifts to send her to college because he believed she deserved every chance the world could give. Maybe the distance is only temporary. Maybe she will soften with time. I tell myself these things, though deep inside, I know hope is becoming harder to hold. So here I am, a man tethered to the past by an old phone and the fading echoes of voices that once filled his world. People see me as stubborn, outdated, even pitiable, but I know what I carry. Within that little device are truths no one else remembers. It sits on the nightstand beside my bed, its plastic worn smooth from years of use, its battery weaker but still alive. Each morning, when I wake, I reach for it the way some people reach for a glass of water. It is not simply habit, it is reassurance, a reminder that I still exist in the network of voices that once loved me. The world may laugh, but I know this phone holds more than anyone suspects. And though they may call me old-fashioned, there will come a day when this so-called relic will speak louder than any of them could ever imagine. The evening that altered the fragile balance of my life began without any particular warning. Clara had invited me to dinner at her house, something she had not done in months, and I was almost childishly pleased by the gesture. I polished my old shoes, ironed a shirt, and even sprayed on a cologne that Evelyn had once bought me, though the bottle had sat half forgotten on the bathroom shelf for years. The drive over was quiet, the roads glistening with the remnants of a late afternoon rain, and for a moment I let myself believe that this invitation meant something more than obligation, that perhaps Clara had remembered I was not just a fading figure on the edge of her life, but her father. When I arrived, her house looked immaculate, all polished wood and spotless windows, a showcase of success. Her husband greeted me at the door with his usual stiffness, a man who shook hands as though measuring your worth by the firmness of your grip. Inside, Clara moved gracefully among her guests, because this was not a simple family dinner, but a gathering of her colleagues, acquaintances from her firm, and a few neighbors whose laughter seemed too loud, too rehearsed. I realized quickly that I was not there to be honored, but to be displayed. The aging father trotted out as a kind of background character in her carefully arranged tableau of modern prosperity. I tried to settle into the role with quiet dignity, taking a seat in the corner of the living room and sipping the glass of wine placed before me, though I noticed Clara avoided filling my glass too much, as though she feared I might lose control. The conversations swirled around business deals, vacations in Europe, and new investments, worlds I did not belong to. I nodded politely when someone asked about my health, smiled faintly when another remarked that retirement must be relaxing, though the word felt like a barb rather than a comfort. For a time, I remained unnoticed, which suited me well enough. But as the evening stretched on, Clara's attention finally fell on me, and with a sly smile, she drew the room's focus in my direction. "Do you know," she said, her voice bright and carrying, "my father still uses one of those old flip phones. The kind with actual buttons. He refuses to get a smartphone." The way she said it was not affectionate, not indulgent, but mocking, and the room responded with laughter, the kind that burns because you know it is aimed squarely at you. Someone asked if the phone even worked anymore. Another joked whether I had to wind it up like a pocket watch, and Clara laughed along, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of being the witty host. I sat frozen, my hand instinctively pressing against the pocket where the phone rested, my fingers feeling the familiar curve of its plastic. In that moment, humiliation washed over me in a wave so strong it nearly took my breath. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the chair and vanish from their amused stares. I had endured many small dismissals over the years, subtle reminders that I no longer belonged to the center of life, but hovered instead on its edges. Yet this felt different. This was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, presenting me to strangers, not as the man who had raised her, sacrificed for her, loved her, but as a relic to be laughed at. I forced a smile, though inside I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than any insult from a stranger could deliver. The evening carried on as if nothing had happened, but I could not shake the weight pressing down on my chest. After dessert, when the guests had thinned and conversation drifted to the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, I excused myself to the hallway and pulled out the phone. Its screen glowed faintly, the old greenish light that seemed almost archaic in this house, filled with gleaming devices. I scrolled through the saved recordings, half seeking comfort in Evelyn's voice, half trying to remind myself why I had never abandoned this little machine. And that was when I stumbled upon the file I had forgotten, a recording not of Evelyn or the children, but of Clara herself. A year earlier, I had accidentally pressed the record button during one of her visits, slipping the phone back into my pocket without realizing it was capturing every word. The memory of that day returned slowly. The hurried way she and her husband had spoken in the kitchen while I sat in the living room. The hushed tones that made me uneasy, though I told myself not to pry. Now, with trembling fingers, I pressed play. The sound crackled faintly, but their voices were unmistakable. Clara's sharp, efficient tone, her husband's deeper murmur. At first, the words seemed ordinary, discussing bills and accounts, but soon the conversation shifted, and what I heard made my blood run cold. They were talking about me, about my finances, my house, my savings, as though I were already gone. They discussed how easy it would be to move my accounts under Clara's control, if I could be convinced to sign a few necessary papers, how it might even be possible to transfer ownership of the house for efficiency's sake. My daughter's voice, once the sweetest sound in my world, dripped with calculation as she laughed softly and said, "He won't know the difference. He still trusts me completely." Her husband replied, "And if he resists, we can always push for medical evaluation." At his age, confusion isn't hard to prove. I sat in the hallway with the phone pressed to my ear, listening as the people I had trusted most reduced me to an obstacle, a figure to be managed, manipulated, and eventually erased. My breath came shallow. My hands shook, and for a long moment I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. The humiliation of the evening, the laughter at my expense, suddenly seemed like nothing compared to the cold betrayal echoing from the tiny speaker of my phone. My own daughter, whom I had cradled in my arms, for whom I had worked endless hours, whose future had been the guiding star of my entire adult life, was plotting to strip me of everything I had left. The recording ended, leaving only silence, but the silence was heavier than the laughter had been. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the worn keys of the phone, the device that had carried me through loneliness and memory, now delivering a truth I could hardly bear. A part of me wanted to deny it, to believe it was a misunderstanding, a fragment of a larger conversation taken out of context. But the words were too clear, the intent too deliberate. They had spoken as conspirators, not as family. When Clara found me in the hallway, she asked lightly if I was lost, her smile the same polished expression she wore for her guests. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and nodded, forcing my face into calmness, though inside a storm was raging. She did not know what I had just heard. She did not know that the very device she mocked in front of her friends had captured her deceit, that in her laughter she had unknowingly revealed her contempt, and that hidden within the battered shell of my phone was a weapon she could not have imagined. That night, as I drove home through the rain-slick streets, the recording played over and over in my mind. I felt as though I were carrying a secret too heavy to contain, a knowledge that burned and yet gave me a strange, grim sense of clarity. My life, once a quiet series of empty days, had been jolted awake by betrayal. I knew then that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The world I thought I lived in, the fragile trust I had placed in my only child, had shattered, and in the shards lay a new reality I could not ignore. The following days passed like a slow fever. I went through the familiar motions of my solitary routine, boiling water for coffee, spreading butter on toast, shuffling through the morning paper. But everything felt altered, as if the world had shifted half a degree and nothing sat right in its place anymore. The knowledge I carried from that recording lodged inside me like a shard of glass I could not dislodge. Each time the phone buzzed with a call or a message from Clara, my heart clenched, and I would let it ring until the sound faded. I could not bear to hear her voice. Knowing what I now knew, the casual cruelty of her laughter at the dinner table had already wounded me. But the revelation that she and her husband had discussed me as if I were little more than a stubborn obstacle to be maneuvered, a senile relic standing in the way of their financial ambitions, poisoned every memory I had of her kindness. Still, I could not act blindly, not with something so grave. I told myself I needed certainty, evidence beyond a single recording from an accidental slip of the phone. Perhaps, I thought, there had been exaggeration or even irony in her tone, a conversation twisted by my own fear. So I began to check. It started innocently enough. I gathered the folders of my bank statements that I had always filed carefully in the cabinet beside my desk. I compared the balances month to month, tracing the columns with my finger, looking for patterns that would confirm or refute what the recording suggested. At first, everything looked ordinary, the slow ebb and flow of withdrawals for groceries, utilities, the occasional medical bill. But then I noticed transfers I could not explain, small amounts at first, 100 here, 200 there, always tagged as joint account settlement or family allocation. They were spaced out, scattered across the months like breadcrumbs I had never noticed before. My chest tightened as the realization dawned that these were not innocent transactions. I made an appointment at the bank, something I had not done in years because most of my dealings were automatic. The young woman behind the counter, polite and perfunctory, tapped at her keyboard when I asked about the withdrawals. She confirmed that they had been authorized, and when I demanded by whom, she hesitated before saying that Clara's name was on the access file as a co-signer for certain accounts. My mind reeled. I remembered vaguely that after Evelyn's death, Clara had insisted I consolidate some accounts for simplicity, that she had sat beside me in the bank office, urging me to sign documents while assuring me it was all routine. In my grief, I had trusted her, had signed without reading the fine print. Now the evidence was before me. My daughter had woven herself into my financial life like a hidden parasite, invisible until the moment it drained enough to be noticed. When I returned home, I felt a heaviness in my limbs, as though I were trudging through water. I pulled out the phone again, replaying the recording. Each time I heard her voice, so casual and confident, discussing my future as though it were a chess move, the truth grew sharper. They were not simply planning, they were already acting. The missing funds, the access permissions, the subtle way she had begun to question my memory during our conversations, all of it pointed to a calculated effort to paint me as feeble, unreliable, a man slipping into senility. I recalled dinners when she corrected me in front of others, moments when she insisted I was misremembering details that I knew were true, her little sighs of pity when I repeated myself. At the time, I thought these were irritations born of her impatience. Now I saw them for what they were, rehearsals for a case against me, the gradual erosion of my credibility so that, when the time came, no one would doubt her story that her father was losing his mind. Sleep became impossible. At night, I wandered the house like a restless ghost, stopping in the rooms where Evelyn's touch lingered in photographs and keepsakes. I asked her silently what I should do, but of course there was no answer, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the old clock on the wall. I felt anger rising inside me, but also shame. Shame that I had been blind, that I had trusted so completely the daughter I had raised with every ounce of devotion I possessed. I remembered the nights I graded papers at the kitchen table while she did her homework beside me, the way she leaned against my shoulder when sleep threatened to take her before the assignments were finished. I remembered working summers, sacrificing vacations, so that she could attend the private college she wanted, believing that education would free her, shape her into a person of character and integrity. To realize that all of that effort had produced someone who now schemed against me cut deeper than words could capture. Yet alongside the pain grew something else, a resolve I had not felt in years. If Clara and her husband thought of me as weak, as senile, as a man who could be tricked into surrendering everything he owned, they were wrong. They had underestimated not only my mind, but the stubborn endurance that had carried me through 72 years of life's disappointments. I would not confront them recklessly, though. I knew enough history to recognize the value of patience, of gathering proof before making a move. Wars are not won by rushing headlong into battle. They are won by waiting for the moment when the enemy reveals their overconfidence. The first true test came sooner than I expected. Clara arrived one afternoon, unannounced, carrying a folder of papers. She breezed into the kitchen with the bright smile she reserved for moments when she wanted something, kissed my cheek with perfunctory warmth, and laid the documents on the table. "It's just some insurance adjustments, Daddy," she said, her voice honeyed. "With your age, it's important to make sure everything is in order. You only need to sign here and here." She tapped the pages with a manicured finger as if guiding a child. I looked at the lines of text, the dense paragraphs in legal jargon I barely understood. My instinct screamed at me that these were not mere insurance adjustments. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of controlling my fury. I asked her calmly if I might keep the documents for a few days to read them carefully. For the briefest instant, irritation flashed in her eyes, quickly masked by a smile. "Of course, Daddy, whatever makes you comfortable. But it's all standard, really. Thornton said it's just better to have it squared away now. After she left, I sat at the table for hours, poring over the papers. I could make little sense of them, but one clause caught my eye. Power of attorney. The phrase leapt from the page like a snake, coiled and ready to strike. If I had signed, I would have ceded control of my affairs, my finances, even decisions about my health, to my daughter and her husband. A cold sweat broke across my skin. The truth of their intentions could not be denied any longer. The recording had been no idle conversation, no stray remark taken out of context. It was a blueprint, and they were already building upon it. That night, I placed the old phone on the table beside the documents, the glow of its small screen reflecting off the legal text. The phone, mocked as a relic, now stood as my only shield, my only weapon. The recording was still there, intact, undeniable proof of their conspiracy. Yet I felt the precariousness of my position. If the phone failed, if it were lost, if they discovered it and destroyed it, I would have nothing but my word. And in the story they had already begun to weave, my word was worth little. The fear of losing that fragile piece of evidence gnawed at me, and I checked the phone repeatedly, charging it, replaying the file to ensure it had not somehow vanished. I became almost paranoid, sleeping with it on the nightstand within arm's reach, as though it were a lifeline. In the days that followed, I began to notice more clearly the subtle ways Clara attempted to undermine me. She corrected me when I mentioned dates or events, insisted I had repeated stories when I was certain I had not, even told neighbors that I sometimes forgot to lock the door at night. Each remark was a stitch in the fabric of a portrait she was crafting, one in which I was no longer competent, no longer reliable. People chuckled, waved it off as affectionate exasperation, but I could see the doubt seeding in their expressions, the sideways glances that suggested they wondered if she was right. I realized then that my battle was not only for my money or my house, but for my dignity, for the truth of who I was and who I remained. And so the first escalation had arrived, though quietly, without fireworks. It came in the form of missing funds, of deceptive documents, of whispered doubts and forced smiles. My world had narrowed to the space between the safety of my old phone and the looming threat of betrayal from the very person I had loved most. I felt the pressure building, the sense that I was standing on a precipice with storm clouds gathering. Yet amid the fear, there was a spark of determination. They believed me weak. They believed me blind. They had no idea that I had already heard their voices conspiring against me, that the very relic they mocked contained the truth that could undo them. It was late one evening when the fragile threads of denial finally snapped, leaving me with no illusions about the path Clara and her husband were carving for me. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet as I paced from room to room, trying to shake the restlessness that had settled into my bones. On the kitchen table lay the folder of papers Clara had tried to coax me into signing, its presence like a silent threat. I had left it there intentionally, a reminder of what I was facing, though each time I glanced at the pages I felt a heaviness settle over my chest. The phone lay beside it, its screen dim, the device that had become both my anchor and my burden. I picked it up and replayed the recording again, my ears straining for some hint of ambiguity that might absolve Clara in my mind. But the words were too plain, too cold. The laughter, the certainty in her voice, as she discussed stripping me of my autonomy, left no space for doubt. The next morning, I forced myself to walk to the bank again, though my knees protested with every step. I requested a full printout of my recent transactions, and as the clerk handed me the pages, I sat down in the lobby to study them. My heart sank as I saw larger withdrawals now, thousands, not hundreds, made in increments, spread across several weeks. Some were disguised as maintenance expenses, others as joint family distributions. I felt the blood drain from my face as the truth came into sharp relief. They were no longer testing the waters, but plunging their hands into my savings with bold confidence. It was theft, slow and deliberate, hidden under the cover of signatures I vaguely remembered scrawling during moments of distraction. Signatures they had perhaps even copied outright. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the numbers, while people bustled around me, their errands trivial, compared to the enormity of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. When I returned home, I spread the documents across the dining table, the bank statements alongside the unsigned papers Clara had left. The pattern was undeniable. They were building a case, a structure designed to trap me like an animal, until one day I would wake to discover I no longer owned my house, no longer controlled my accounts, no longer even had the right to decide what medicine I took or what doctor. I saw the fear that had haunted me in the nights crystallized into certainty. My daughter intended to declare me incompetent, to have me placed under her authority as though I were a child. The thought twisted my stomach until I nearly vomited. I imagined strangers coming into my home, appraisers, lawyers, men in suits measuring and signing papers, while I was pushed into a corner, stripped of dignity, stripped of voice. The breaking point came later that week when Clara called unexpectedly. Her voice carried that polished sweetness I had come to recognize as dangerous. She asked how I was feeling, whether I had been sleeping, whether I had noticed any confusion lately. Her words dripped with false concern, and I realized with horror that she was rehearsing lines she would later deliver to a doctor or a court, preparing the narrative of my decline. I answered cautiously, trying not to reveal the fury building in my chest. But when the call ended, I slammed the phone down so hard the plastic cracked along one edge. I stared at the tiny fracture in the casing, terror surging through me at the thought that the device might fail. If the phone broke, if the recording vanished, everything would collapse into her version of events. I sat there holding the battered device in both hands, whispering to it as though it were a living ally. Don't fail me now. You're all I have. That night, sleep eluded me again. I walked the house in circles until exhaustion forced me into the armchair where Evelyn used to sit, clutching the phone against my chest like a talisman. My thoughts spiraled darker with every hour. I realized that if Clara succeeded, I would not only lose my possessions, but my very self. They would reduce me to a shadow, a man stripped of agency, his every action monitored and controlled. The cruelty of it struck me hardest when I remembered how I had once cradled her tiny body in the crook of my arm, whispering promises of protection, of safety, of unconditional love. Now she was preparing to return me to a state of helplessness, but not out of care, out of greed. By dawn, a decision had settled in my mind with the clarity of stone. I could no longer wait, no longer pretend that this storm would pass if I simply endured. The evidence was real, the danger immediate, and the only thing standing between me and the abyss was the fragile recording on that old phone. My role as a passive witness had ended. I had to act to bring the truth into the light before they tightened the net around me. But as I looked at the cracked plastic casing and the flickering battery indicator, I felt the precariousness of my situation. Every ounce of proof I possessed lived inside this fragile relic, a device mocked by my daughter as a dinosaur, yet carrying within it the only voice strong enough to destroy her lies. The midpoint of my life's quiet decline had arrived. I was no longer an aging father drifting toward irrelevance. I was a man standing on the edge of a war for his dignity and survival. Clara thought she had already won, that her narrative of my weakness would soon be accepted by everyone around us. But she did not know what I carried in my pocket. She did not know that the laughter at her dinner table had planted the seed of her undoing. And as I sat in the gray light of dawn, the phone warm in my hand, I swore to myself that no matter the cost, I would not let them bury me alive. The weeks that followed became a strange theater of deception in which I was both audience and unwilling participant. Clara began to appear more often at the house, sometimes with Thornton at her side, sometimes alone, always with the same air of brisk efficiency that she mistook for affection. She would bring bags of groceries I had not asked for, or adjust the curtains without being invited, or rearrange the pill bottles on the kitchen counter as though she were a nurse and I her patient. At first glance, these gestures might have looked like care to an outsider, but I felt the falseness beneath them, the way her eyes lingered not on me, but on the rooms, the furniture, the documents that lay on my desk. She was surveying her inheritance in advance, rehearsing her control over a life she believed already belonged to her. Each time she left, I felt a little more like a stranger in my own home. Thornton's presence was worse. He carried himself with the smugness of a man who believes he already holds victory, his voice measured, his expressions crafted like a politician's. When he spoke to me, it was always with a faint smile, as though he were humoring a child. One afternoon, he leaned against the doorway of my study while I was trying to read. "Oberon," he said, using my first name with deliberate informality. "Clara and I have been talking. It might be time to think about downsizing. This house is big, more than you need, and maintaining it must be exhausting. There are wonderful retirement communities these days, safe, comfortable, with staff to take care of everything. You'd have friends your age, activities, no worries." He spoke as though he were offering me a gift, but beneath his words I heard the sentence clearly: "We want your house." I told him firmly that I had no interest in leaving my home, that I was perfectly capable of managing. But he only nodded indulgently and muttered something about thinking of my health. Later that week, Clara brought brochures, glossy pages filled, with smiling seniors playing cards or walking by manicured gardens. She laid them out on the kitchen table as though presenting options, and her tone carried a strange mixture of insistence and pity. Daddy, it would be better for you. These places have medical staff, security, everything you need. You'd never have to worry about bills or upkeep again. And Thornton and I could check on you easily. I stared at the photos of strangers pretending to be happy, my throat tight with anger. But I kept my voice calm. I told her I was fine where I was, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life in the house where Evelyn and I had built our family. She pressed her lips together in frustration, and I saw in her eyes that she was calculating how to override my refusal. The true escalation, however, came not in words, but in actions. One morning, I went to the bank to withdraw cash for groceries and discovered that my account balance was lower than expected, much lower. I requested a statement, and the clerk hesitated before showing me a transfer of $5,000 to Clara's account, authorized under my signature. I felt my knees weaken. I had never signed such a transfer. When I demanded an explanation, the clerk showed me a scanned copy of the authorization, and indeed my signature was there, reproduced with uncanny accuracy. My hands shook as I stared at the page. It was my name, but I had not written it. The realization that they had forged my hand, that they were now brazen enough to steal outright, sent a chill through me, colder than anything I had felt before. I returned home in a daze, the statement crumpled in my pocket, and sat at the kitchen table for hours. The recording on my phone, the forged signature, the attempts to push me into a retirement home, all the threads of their scheme were tightening around me. They were not waiting for me to falter naturally. They were accelerating the process, pushing me towards a manufactured incompetence that would justify their control. That night, I could barely breathe from the pressure of it, and I realized that silence was no longer an option. Yet I still hesitated. A part of me clung to the hope that Clara might turn back, that perhaps she did not fully understand the cruelty of what she was doing, that she was being led by Thornton's greed rather than her own heart. But each new betrayal chipped away at that fragile hope until little remained but bitterness. Then came the dinner that shattered even that. Clara insisted I join them at a restaurant downtown, a place far grander than anything I would have chosen, filled with polished tables and waiters in pressed uniforms. I wore my old suit, the one Evelyn had loved, though it hung loose on me now. When I arrived, I saw at once that I was not invited as a guest, but as a prop. At their table sat another couple, wealthy acquaintances of theirs, and as soon as I sat down, the performance began. Clara introduced me as though I were a dependent rather than a father, telling anecdotes about how forgetful I had become, how she had to remind me of doctor's appointments, how I once nearly set the kitchen on fire by leaving a pot unattended. Each story was a lie, but she told them with such casual charm that the couple laughed, nodding sympathetically, offering knowing remarks about how difficult aging parents could be. I sat there, my fork poised above the plate, my face burning, listening to my daughter weave a false narrative of my decline while strangers smiled at her wit. I tried to interject, to correct her, but each time she patted my hand and said, "It's all right, Daddy. You don't remember? But it's normal at your age." Thornton chimed in with mock-concerned comments, shaking his head as though pitying me. For the first time in my life, I felt the peculiar sensation of being erased in real time, of having my identity rewritten in front of others, and being powerless to stop it. By the end of the evening, I was not only humiliated but terrified, because I saw how convincing she could be. If she spoke this way to friends, to acquaintances, what would stop her from telling the same stories to a judge, a doctor, or a lawyer? And who would believe me, a solitary old man, against the polished voices of my daughter and her husband? When I returned home, I collapsed into my chair and pressed play on the recording once more, needing to hear their voices again, not in the polished lies of the restaurant, but in the raw conspiracy they had spoken when they thought I was not listening. The contrast made me shudder. This was no misunderstanding. This was a plan, deliberate and malicious, and I was its target. The phone, fragile as it was, had become my only ally, the sole proof that my daughter was not the caring protector she pretended to be, but the architect of my ruin. I realized then that I could no longer rely on luck. If the phone died, if the recording was lost, I would be crushed beneath their story. I needed to preserve it, to make copies, to bring it into the hands of someone who could help. The very next day, I walked to a small electronics shop on the edge of town, clutching the phone in my pocket like a treasure. The clerk was a young man, barely older than my grandchildren, with piercings in his ears and an impatience in his voice. I explained that I needed to transfer recordings from my phone onto another device, something safer. He looked at the old flip phone with a smirk, the same kind of smirk Clara's friends had given me, and for a moment I almost turned around and left. But I forced myself to stay. He plugged it into a computer with an adapter, his fingers flying over the keyboard, and within minutes he had copied the files onto a flash drive. I paid him, clutching the small stick in my hand as though it were a weapon. For the first time since hearing the recording, I felt a glimmer of safety. Even if the phone broke, the truth was preserved, but safety was fragile. That evening, Clara arrived again, cheerful on the surface, but with an edge to her voice. She asked pointedly what I had been doing that day, whether I had gone into town, whether I had seen anyone. When I told her I had gone shopping, she tilted her head and studied me with narrowed eyes, as though sensing something had shifted. Her suspicion chilled me. She lingered in the study longer than usual, glancing at the desk, at the drawers, at the stack of bank statements I had been reviewing. When she left, I felt the air in the house lighter, as though a predator had withdrawn, but the unease did not fade. She was watching me more closely now, sensing that I was no longer the passive, compliant father she thought I was, and so the escalation deepened. No longer was this a game of subtle hints and whispered plans. It had become open theft, public humiliation, and quiet intimidation. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, pressing, and dangerous. I understood now that if I did not act soon, if I did not bring my evidence to someone who could protect me, Clara and Thornton would tighten their grip until escape was impossible. They had underestimated me once, mocking my phone as a relic, believing me too feeble to resist, but they would not underestimate me again. The war had begun in earnest, and though I was weary, though my body was frail, the fire inside me had been reignited. I would not allow my daughter to bury me while I still breathed. The day the truth stepped out of the shadows began, not with a bang, but with a letter, cream paper with a crisp black seal from the county court, informing me that a petition for guardianship had been filed by my daughter on the grounds of diminished capacity, that a temporary hearing had been set for the following Friday, that an investigator might visit my home before the date, and that I should be prepared to present any evidence I believed relevant. I read it 3 times at the kitchen table. With the old phone lying next to the cup of coffee, I could not bring myself to drink, and while fear rose up like a black tide, it did not crest, because behind it came something steadier and older and harder, the thin wire of resolve that had held. Through years of classrooms and grief and the private humiliations of aging, and I understood that the hearing was not a disaster, but a stage finally set where their performance would meet mine, and where the small, battered device my daughter derided would be allowed to speak in its own plain, implacable voice. I called a local attorney recommended by the clerk at the bank, a woman named Harris with calm eyes and a careful way of listening that made my spinning thoughts slow into order. I brought her the bank statements, the unsigned power of attorney, the forged transfer, and at the end, with hands that trembled in equal parts anger and relief, I placed the phone on her desk and told her what it held. She did not smirk at the relic or pity me for clinging to it. She opened a desk drawer, took out a charger cord with a nest of adapters, and within a minute had the screen glowing, the menu open, the file selected. The voices of my daughter and her husband filled the small office in short, sharp phrases discussing my assets, the path to a medical finding, the way to move the house without messy resistance. And when the recording ended, Ms. Harris exhaled, not dramatically, but like someone who had just seen the shape of the case change, and said we would secure the phone in her office safe after creating a forensic duplicate with a chain of custody. We would schedule an evaluation with a geriatric specialist of her choosing. We would contact the bank's fraud department formally rather than as a distressed walk-in. And we would go to court not with injured outrage, but with documents, affidavits, timestamps, and the simple, grainy truth of that audio. The week telescoped into a narrow corridor of errands that felt both urgent and dreamlike, as if I were walking someplace my legs remembered before my mind could name it. A technician with careful hands pulled the files from the phone onto 2 encrypted drives, while a notary logged the time and placed her seal on a statement of procedure. Ms. Harris's paralegal photographed the cracked casing and the scuffed keys and printed the photos with captions noting the make and model. I sat for 2 hours in a quiet room while a doctor in a gray suit asked me to recall lists and subtract sevens and retell a short story from memory, then surprised me by inquiring about my career and the year Clara won her little spelling bee and the date of Evelyn's last garden party, as if he understood that the mind is more than a score, and that grief and dignity also have to be measured. When he shook my hand at the end, he did not say the result, only that he would send a formal report by Wednesday, which arrived on Tuesday with a paragraph that made my throat knot with gratitude, concluding there was no evidence of dementia, that my performance was consistent with healthy aging, that any claim of incompetence based on memory loss would be medically unsupported. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed with the deliberation of a man who knows he will stand in bright light and be studied. I ironed a shirt until the fabric shone faintly, knotted the tie Evelyn had given me the Christmas Clara, left for college, polished the shoes more for my own sake than any judge's, and slipped the phone into the inner pocket of my jacket, even though Ms. Harris had the evidence drive, because a part of me needed the original near my heart, like a relic of a private faith. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper, and in the corridor outside the small courtroom, I saw Thornton standing like a man, rehearsing his winning statement, shoulders square, jaw set, while Clara paced with her phone in her hand. 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, the old cadence of her impatience, except that when she looked up and saw me, she did not smile the bright hostess smile I had come to fear, but the smaller smile of a person who believes the endgame has arrived, and that the pieces will move as she planned. Inside, the judge was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, economical with words, the sort of man who lets silence do half of the questioning. Their lawyer began with a soft-voiced presentation about concern and safety and recent episodes of confusion, about the kindness of a daughter who had rearranged her life to prevent an aged parent from harm, about the temporary nature of their request and the gravity with which they approached it. And as he spoke, I felt the old fear dart at my ribs because I knew how plausible it sounded to ears unused to the subterranean currents of family greed. Miss Harris did not try to match their silk with silk. She began plain, almost blunt, with the physician's report dismissing cognitive decline, with the timeline of transfers, with enlarged prints of signatures placed side by side where anyone with eyes could see that one O-loop had the hesitation tremor of a tracing. The judge's expression barely moved, only his pen scratched more rapidly, and then Miss Harris asked for permission to play an audio exhibit authenticated by her office, recorded in my home on a date and at a time corroborated by my phone's metadata and by a message Clara sent me the same afternoon, and the other lawyer stood to object. On grounds I did not follow well enough to paraphrase, something about consent and expectation of privacy and reliability, to which Miss Harris replied with case citations and the assertion that I, a party to the conversation, had the right to record in our jurisdiction, that the device had been maintained, duplicated, and sealed under supervision, that what the court would hear was not an edited fragment, but a continuous file containing statements of intent, and the judge nodded for her to proceed, which seemed to pull the air out of the room, as if a door to weather had just opened. The moment the first seconds of static settled, and Clara's voice emerged, everyday and unguarded, a version of her I had not heard in years, the version that speaks without rehearsing how she will sound to others, I felt a terrible tenderness move through me and then harden into something like mourning as the words that followed ran their course. I watched her face and saw the small flinches ripple through the mask as she recognized phrasing she could not disown. Her hand went to her throat, the way it did in childhood when caught in a lie, and Thornton leaned forward as if he might pluck the sound from the air and fold it back into silence. The judge did not look at them while it played. He looked at me, perhaps to see whether Vindication had a shape, perhaps to judge whether a father was enjoying a daughter's fall. And I tried to keep my expression from turning into either triumph or collapse, because neither felt honest. What I felt was an old kind of grief with a clean edge, like the night we signed the papers for Clara's first apartment, and I understood she was both mine and already gone. When the recording ended, there was no applause, only the small practical noises of a courtroom breathing again. And then questions, simple, pointed, deliberate, which Ms. Harris answered without embroidery. Yes, the bank had opened a fraud inquiry. Yes, my access had been locked down and my signatures replaced with in-person verification. Yes, I had declined to sign any power of attorney. Yes, the physician's report found no dementia. Their lawyer attempted to pivot, to claim the clip was joking context, to suggest stress, to blame Thornton for the more callous language, while painting Clara as a frightened daughter led astray. Clara began to cry, not the silent, private tears of a person split open by shame, but the conspicuous heaves of a performance pitched toward leniency. And while a human part of me wanted to push a glass of water toward her, another part remembered those dinners where she crafted a clumsy mythology of my decline for strangers and patted my hand when I tried to object, and I stayed still. The judge spoke finally, not loudly, but with the flat weight of decision, denying the petition, issuing an interim protective order, limiting their access to my person and property, referring the financial evidence to the district attorney for review, and recommending that all future contact occur in writing or in the presence of counsel until further notice, and though the words were measured, their effect was seismic, an invisible wall lowering into place where there had been only fog. We filed out into the corridor, and the quiet there felt stranger than any shouting might have been. Clara approached with a look that broke and rebuilt itself 3 times in a second, like a face reflected in rippled water. And she said my name not as a daughter calls a father, but as someone calls a witness who has surprised them, and asked in a cracked whisper how I could do this to family, how I could humiliate her in public, how I could choose an object over her. And I realized she meant the phone as if it were a rival, and I answered with more gentleness than I expected to have left that what had humiliated her were her own words, not my willingness to let them be heard, that what she called an object had simply preserved a truth she hoped to bury, that I would have chosen her over anything if she had chosen me over what she wanted to take. Thornton tugged at her elbow and muttered that this was not over, his confidence already smaller, his eyes avoiding mine, and Ms. Harris placed a light hand at my shoulder and guided me toward the stairwell before I could be baited into old, useless arguments. Back home, the house felt different, not larger, not lighter exactly, but steadier, as if the foundation had remembered its purpose. I set the phone on the table, and for a long time I did not move, listening to the ordinary noises, the refrigerator, a car passing, a dog barking 2 streets over, and within those unremarkable sounds, the silence that for years had tasted like loneliness, now tasted like simple quiet, which is not a sad thing at all. I knew there would be more steps, bank meetings, and perhaps depositions, neighbors who had heard one story and would have to learn another, grandchildren, who might look at me with new, wary eyes until time sorted their loyalties. But the pivot had been made, and the tide that had seemed to carry me toward an erasure had turned, and in the middle of my kitchen, with late light flattening across the floor, I took the phone in both hands and thanked it aloud the way a man might thank a loyal hound saved from an old storm. And if that seems foolish to anyone who has not lived long enough to understand that some objects are containers for souls not their own, I can only say that my daughter called it a dinosaur and laughed, and it answered with a voice that unmade her lie and returned to me the simple right to live my last years as myself. In the weeks after the hearing, the world did not transform with trumpets or fireworks. It simply settled, as if a taut wire had finally been loosened to a livable pitch, and the house resumed its ordinary breathing while the official letters followed one another in their measured way. The bank confirmed the fraud hold and restored the missing funds. The district attorney opened a file and later proposed a plea agreement contingent on restitution and an ethics referral. Thornton's firm reassigned him from a project that required a clean bond, and Clara submitted a resignation letter phrased as a sabbatical, but framed by a quiet internal inquiry that would make any triumphant return unlikely. None of it made me jubilant, not even when amid Harris called to say the protective order would remain in place for a year and that any contact from Clara or her husband must be through counsel, because what I felt was less victory than the ending of a long chant of dread, a cessation of noise that allowed ordinary sounds to be heard again, the kettle's faint whistle, a sparrow scolding the cat 2 doors down, the page of a book turning without my hand shaking. I did the practical things first, because practicality is a way to teach the heart how to keep going. I met with the bank and set alerts for every transaction. I closed the old joint account that should have been closed years ago. I rewrote my will, with language that left no door ajar for the clever. Establishing a small scholarship in Evelyn's name for student teachers who think history can still save a few lost souls, and a separate trust for the grandchildren that cannot be touched by their parents, and that unlocks only with a letter written to me in their own words, not to buy forgiveness, but to earn the truth of our kinship without anyone standing between us. I bought a small safe and tucked inside it the flash drive Ms. Harris made, the notarized transcript, the deed to the house, and the worn wedding photograph where Evelyn's eyes are laughing because I had stepped on her train at the reception and she had decided to forgive me before I had even apologized. Purpose, like appetite, returns quietly when it is ready, and mine came in the form of a flyer thumbtacked in the library about a volunteer project to record the oral histories of retired workers who built this town's old mills and schools. And though the coordinator had a box of cheap digital recorders, I found myself bringing the old flip phone anyway. Not because it was the best tool, but because the men and women who sat across from me relaxed when they saw something humble on the table, something with buttons and a hinge, and they told their stories in long, unhurried braids while my thumb hovered over the red key. And in those afternoons, I remembered the classroom version of myself who could listen without rushing and ask a question that opened another door, Sometimes on the way home, I would stop by the lake and play back a few seconds of a mill whistle or a laugh and think how strange it is that the same device that preserved my daughter's betrayal now held the small music of strangers, and how both kinds of truth belong to the same ledger of a life honestly kept. One evening, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, I heard a young woman's voice stumble and then steady. "Grandpa, it's June." My granddaughter, who had been a child with chalk-smudged fingers the last time we baked cookies in Evelyn's kitchen, and she spoke in the wary tone of someone stepping into a room where the furniture has been moved, saying she had heard things and didn't know what was true, and could we meet someplace public, maybe the diner by the bus station, the station. And I said yes, because whatever had happened between her parents and me did not cancel the thread that ran from her hand in mine when she was 5 to this moment. At the diner, she ordered tea. She did not drink and apologized for holidays missed and for repeating her mother's lines about my forgetfulness. And I told her that people we love sometimes tell stories to protect themselves from what they did, that I wouldn't play the recording for her because I did not want our bond to rest on the sound of her mother's worst hour, but that I would give her the transcript if she wished to read it when she was ready, and she nodded and did not take it, which I counted as wisdom. She asked if she could call sometimes, and I said yes, with one condition: that money and gossip would never be the first topic, that we would start with weather and books and whether the moon looked big or small that night. And she smiled a little and said that sounded like a rule her great-grandmother would have liked. And we talked about nothing important until important snuck in without ceremony, as it always does. I did buy a small modern phone at Ms. Harris's urging, so that my doctor could send messages and the bank could ping me when something moved. But I could not make myself replace the flip phone, whose hinge creaks now and whose battery, despite the spare I found from a warehouse in Ohio, tires by evening. And sometimes I think it is like me in that way, willing to do a day's work before its light softens and asks for rest. At night, I place both phones on the nightstand, the sleek one face down and the old one open like a book. And I listen for a minute to Evelyn's birthday voicemail, the one where she tries to sing and laughs at herself, and then to the new recordings of the mill workers and the old one of Clara planning what she did, because it is important, I have learned, not to curate your history so ruthlessly that only flattering chapters remain. And after I click the phone shut, the room holds a kind of resolved quiet, a human quiet, and I sleep. Once, a neighbor asked whether I had forgiven Clara, and I told him the truth as I understand it today, that forgiveness is not a door we fling wide, but a small window we open when the air needs changing, that I have opened that window a crack, because I cannot live in a room filled only with the smell of what happened, but that a window is not a welcome mat, and a crack is not an invitation. If she ever writes to me in her own unscripted voice, I will answer in mine, but I will not return to the play where she writes my lines. Months have passed without spectacle, which is a blessing I am learning to treat as one, and the town has placed our oral histories in the library catalog and the scholarship fund sent a photograph of a first-year teacher standing in front of a chalkboard with a grin that made my chest ache with a good kind of pain. And on Sundays, I brew coffee with the pinch of salt Evelyn taught me, and carry a mug to the porch where the light is generous. And sometimes I take the flip phone out and run my thumb over its battered skin and think that the world can call it a dinosaur forever if it wishes, because when it mattered, it remembered what people said when they thought no one was listening. It kept faith with what was real, and it gave me back my name, which is all an old man asks to keep at the end.